Hello and welcome to In the Word, your weekday worship guide brought to you by Ada Christian Reformed Church. My name is Jacob Toman, and today we're talking about Deuteronomy chapters 11 through 15. Those are the chapters that we are scheduled to read, one chapter at a time, throughout this upcoming week. Some people have asked me throughout my ministry if there are really any substantive differences between confessionally Reformed churches and big box evangelical churches. Both churches are filled with groups of people formed around common shared purposes and broadly held beliefs regarding the significance of Jesus. Yet one of the major distinctives between big box evangelical churches and, broadly speaking, other Protestant denominations and confessionally Reformed churches is in how we understand the Old Testament and God's instructions regarding shared community life. A major foundational piece of that shared community life is worship. Our understanding of worship shapes our communities into very different groups of people. In these chapters of Deuteronomy this week, we hear about God's commands regarding how community life is to be shaped, including regarding worship. One of the primary instructions throughout the Bible regarding worship of God by the believing community is that God sets the boundaries for what is good and not good in worship. Nowhere does God's word say, "Do what you'd like to commemorate and honor me." Nowhere does God's word say, "Look at the way other gods are worshipped and bring what practices you like to honor me." Often what God says is the exact opposite. In preparing his people to enter the promised land, God gave instructions that worship and communal life was not to be regulated by everyone doing as they saw fit. We hear that and read that in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 8. Instead, God provided instructions for what would be good in communal worshiping life. This principle in the Reformed tradition is articulated and summarized as the regulative principle of worship. That's a big term that simply means God has jurisdiction, and God has made clear his instructions for his people in worship. To reject what God has instructed or to add to it is to cease to live lovingly with gratitude towards God, as we're told in Deuteronomy 12:32. It'd be a bit like giving a present to someone of something we knew that they didn't like. Just as God has given commands for marriage, for civil law, for private property, for child raising, for social security, and leadership, so too has God given commands for communal worship. The worship of the people of God is to be uniquely distinct and distinguished from the way other peoples worship. Our unique and distinct worship is not due to our own imaginative ingenuity, but instead comes from a loving, loyal commitment to God's ways springing up from a heart of thankful gratitude to God for his goodness and grace to us. Our worship together as a community is a testimony and witness of our grateful thanks to God. Our worship isn't an add-on, a side project, or merely a ritual habit. Our worship, biblically shaped in conformity to God's instructions, is to be a blessing to God in thanks for his great blessing of us in grace. How we worship is a living display of the God who we worship, and it reveals the motivating reason behind why we worship. God hasn't left us alone to figure these things out. God has lovingly instructed his people for generations in this formative, reverent, celebratory gathering that is called Christian community worship. God's commands are not a burden or outdated, but instead are to us the path of joyful delight. Thanks so much for joining us today. If you've got any questions about anything that we're reading this week as we read through the Bible, you can always reach out. My email is pastorjacob@adacrc.org. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to catching you next week.